Three academics find a photograph from 1862 that hides a terrible secret. When they enlarge the image, they discover evidence that powerful families have kept buried for more than a century. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss the next video. It was a rainy October afternoon at Georgetown University when the lives of three academics changed forever. Dr. Elena Martinez, a respected 42-year-old Civil War historian, was digitalizing military archives in the Lowinger Library alongside her assistant James Morrison and the department director, Dr. Marcus Thompson. The photograph seemed ordinary. Soldiers from the 50th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment posing in front of a barn in Maryland. The date indicated September 15, 1862, 3 days before the Battle of Antietam. "Have you tried enlarging the image?" asked Marcus. "With current technology, we could see details that previous historians were never able to examine." James began working with AI-powered image enhancement software. His fingers flew over the keyboard as he applied filters to increase the resolution of the century-old photograph. "This is incredible," Elena murmured as the image became sharper. "I can see the threads of their uniforms, the marks on their rifles." But when James zoomed in on the background of the image, something in the barn's shadows began to take shape. What they had initially taken for farm tools revealed itself as something much more sinister. Elena stood up abruptly, her face losing all color. "My God," she whispered. In the barn's shadows, barely visible but undeniably present, there were human bodies, dozens of them stacked like firewood. Some were civilians by their clothing. Others appeared to be Confederate soldiers, disarmed. "This can't be real," said Marcus, but his voice trembled. Silence filled the library. The Union soldiers in the foreground posed serenely, oblivious to the evidence of massacre behind them. "It means," said Elena in a barely audible voice, "that we're seeing evidence of something that someone worked very hard to keep secret." None of them knew that their discovery had set in motion events that would reveal not only horrors of the past, but present dangers for those who challenge established historical narratives. The next day, Eleanor arrived early at her office, but she hadn't been able to sleep. The images from the photograph had haunted her dreams. James was already waiting for her with coffee and his laptop open. "I spent all night researching," he confessed. "The records of the 54th Regiment for September 15, 1862 have something strange." "What did you find?" "There's a gap. The regiment's daily records have a blank space of 6 hours for that specific date, as if someone had torn pages from the official book." Elena approached to examine the documents. In her experience, Civil War military records were extremely detailed. James opened another window. "This is the most disturbing part. I located a letter from Corporal Timothy Walsh to his wife. Dear Martha, terrible things have occurred that I cannot describe. The Colonel has ordered us not to speak of what we saw at the Miller barn. May God forgive us." The Miller barn. Elena knew the family had been property owners of a farm in Maryland, known for Confederate sympathies but officially neutral. Marcus entered with an unknown woman. "Elena, I present Dr. Sarah Chen from the Smithsonian Institute, specialist in authentication of historical photographs." Chen approached professionally. "I have performed preliminary analysis of the digital image, the types of photographic paper, chemical composition, grain patterns. Everything is consistent with 1860s techniques. That means it's authentic. The analyses strongly suggest yes. However, I would need to examine the original physical photograph to be completely sure." Marcus exchanged a significant look with James. "There's our problem. This morning we went to Arlington to retrieve the original photograph. We were informed that the entire box had been reclassified overnight," James explained. "It's no longer available for national security reasons." Chen closed her laptop. When historical material is reclassified so abruptly after a significant discovery, it usually indicates that there are people in positions of power who prefer that information not be made public. Elena walked to the window. "Doesn't it seem like too much of a coincidence to you?" "Maybe that's exactly the reason they reclassified the material so quickly," said James. "Did they know that without access to the physical photograph we couldn't prove our findings?" Elena looked at the image on her screen. "We have to continue. Those people deserve to have the truth known." Monday morning, Elena found a man waiting for her in front of her classroom. His appearance was impeccable but intimidating. Dark suit, neat gray hair, and calculating blue eyes. "Dr. Martinez," he said, with a soft but firm voice. "I'm Richard Hewthorne from the Department of Veterans Affairs. I'd like to speak about your recent discovery." Elena felt her hair stand on end. How do you know about that? When it comes to military material that could affect the reputation of historical units, it's our job to be informed. He gestured toward a bench. Could we sit down? I understand you found a photograph you consider significant, continued Hawthorne, one that could be misinterpreted if taken out of context. As a historian, my job is to interpret evidence based on verifiable facts. But sometimes evidence can be complex. What seems obvious may have different explanations when examined in appropriate context. He leaned toward her. I represent families that have served this country for generations. They prefer that the memory of their heroic ancestors not be tarnished by erroneous interpretations. Eleanor stood up. This conversation is over. It would be prudent for you to consider the consequences of continuing, said Hawthorne, his voice hardening. Georgetown values highly the donations from various patriotic foundations. The threat was clear. Elena felt fear and indignation. Are you threatening me? I'm simply providing context for an informed decision. During lunch, Elena told James and Marcus about Hawthorne. Marcus had received a call from the dean about concerns from important foundations. The kind that affects the department budget, said Marcus grimly, and potentially our positions. Are you suggesting we abandon the investigation? Asked Elena. I'm suggesting extreme caution about how we proceed. James leaned in. But if we have evidence of a covered-up war crime, don't we have a moral obligation to expose it? We need more evidence, said Elena finally. Something irrefutable, and we need to protect ourselves while we do it. What they didn't know was that their decision to continue discreetly would put them on the radar of forces much more dangerous than they imagined. Elena and James adopted a careful routine. They arrived separately at the Library of Congress. They sat at different tables, consulted apparently unrelated material. Only when they were sure of not being observed did they meet discreetly. The library housed one of the most extensive collections of Civil War personal material. Soldiers' letters, officers' diaries, family documents donated over decades. It was their best hope of finding independent testimonies. On the third day, James made a crucial discovery. In the diary of Chaplain William Henderson, he found an entry from September 17, 1862. The men of the 50th Crude have returned from the Miller Barn. Many have requested confession, something unusual for these veterans. They speak of orders that go against the most basic Christian principles. Corporal Johnson cried like a child, describing what he witnessed. May God have mercy on our souls. Eleanor found correspondence from Catherine Miller to her sister in Baltimore. Dear Sarah, terrible things have occurred on our property. The soldiers brought Confederate prisoners and civilians accused of being spies. What happened afterward in our barn, I cannot write without my hands trembling. They have threatened my family, if we speak. The documents painted a consistent picture. Something had deeply traumatized both perpetrators and witnesses. Meanwhile, Dr. Chen was investigating photographic archives. I found something disturbing at the Massachusetts Historical Society, she said during a clandestine meeting. They had records of photographs of the 54th Regiment from the Maryland campaign, but all images from September 14, 16 had been removed when transferred to a private collection in 1923. With no information about which or why, Chen drank coffee. I found similar patterns at Harvard and Yale. Someone had been systematically removing photographic evidence for decades. Then Elena received the call that would change everything. A nervous woman's voice whispering, if you want to understand what happened at the Miller Barn and why it has remained hidden, investigate the Blackwood family, specifically Colonel Theodore Blackwood. The line went dead, leaving Elena with more questions than answers, not knowing she was about to discover a century-old conspiracy. The investigation into the Blackwoods revealed a network of influence that Elena and James had not anticipated. Theodore Blackwood had not simply been a colonel, he had directly commanded the unit during the Maryland campaign, and as they discovered, had architected the events at the Miller Barn. Look at this, said James during a secret meeting. Theodore not only became rich after the war, he married Isabella Thornton, whose family controlled important banking interests in Boston. Elena studied the genealogical documents. The Thorntons, that name sounds familiar to me. The Thornton Blackwood Foundation is one of the main donors to Georgetown, Harvard, Yale, and dozens of prestigious universities. James opened another window. Their descendants are everywhere. The family had grown and diversified, maintaining influence through strategic marriages and intelligent investments. They had interests in media, philanthropic foundations, positions on university boards, and several members had served in high government positions. Do you see the pattern? Wherever someone could investigate American military history, the Blackwoods have influence. Elena understood the magnitude. It's not just about protecting the reputation of a dead ancestor. It's about protecting a family narrative fundamental to their status for 5 generations. The most impactful discovery came with evidence of a formal organization established in the 1920s. In Boston archives, Elena found minutes from the Historical Preservation Circle. The 1923 minutes included representatives from prominent New England families, all with ancestors in military units involved in incidents similar to the Miller Barn. They institutionalized the cover-up, Elena murmured. They established a fund to protect the reputation of American heroes against malicious historical interpretations. The minutes revealed a systematic strategy: identify problematic material, acquire it for private collections, influence academic narratives through donations, and use political pressure when necessary. They speak of managing the historical narrative to ensure that future generations appropriately understand the heroism of our ancestors, read James. It's pure propaganda. The circle had operated for a century, refining methods and expanding influence. They had funded specific chairs, influenced textbooks, established scholarships that directed academics toward appropriate topics. This explains why we never found evidence before, said Elena. It's not that it didn't exist, it was systematically removed. The Historical Preservation Circle had tolerated research while they believed they could control it. But when they realized Elena had obtained information from an internal source, they escalated their tactics. Elena arrived at her office to find that her computer had been confiscated for computer security problems. All her research files, including digital copies of the Miller Barn photograph, had disappeared from the university server. That afternoon, James received a call from Human Resources, informing him that there were inconsistencies in his scholarship application and that his funding was being suspended. Marcus faced direct pressure. The dean informed him that the board had received complaints about his inadequate supervision. Basically, he had to choose between his position as director or continuing to support the investigation. Rumors about my previous research have begun to circulate, said Elena during an emergency meeting at a cafe off campus. Colleagues who had respected my work for years suddenly questioned my methodology. The discrediting campaign was coordinated and effective. Academic journals that had published Elena's articles began to review her credentials. Conferences where she was scheduled to speak suddenly found scheduling conflicts. It's a professional operation, observed James. They know exactly how to destroy an academic career without leaving obvious traces. But the most personal pressure came when Elena discovered she was being followed. The same black car appeared near her apartment, the university, the supermarket. When she confronted the driver, he simply smiled and drove away. They want us to know they're watching us, said Marcus. It's psychological intimidation. One night, Eleanor found her apartment subtly altered. Nothing had been stolen, but books were in slightly different positions, drawers partially open. The message was clear. They could access her private life whenever they wanted. We have to make a decision, said Elena during another clandestine meeting. Either we give up now or we find a way to make this public before they silence us completely. James had been working on a solution. I contacted an investigative journalist from the Washington Post. He's interested in the story but needs more corroborative evidence. Can we trust him? Asked Marcus. At this point, do we have another option? Responded Elena. The circle has demonstrated it can manipulate academic institutions. Maybe we need the power of the media to balance the situation. The decision to go to the press would mark a point of no return in their fight against forces that had operated in the shadows for more than a century. The call came at 2:30 a.m., waking Elena from a restless sleep. The same woman's voice that had mentioned the Blackwoods, but this time more urgent. Dr. Martinez, I know you're being pressured to abandon your investigation. We need to meet. I have documents that prove everything you've discovered and much more. Eleanor had been expecting this call but still felt nervous. Who are you? Someone who has been inside the circle for years and can no longer live with these secrets. Luna Cafe tomorrow at 7 p.m. Come alone and bring a recorder. Luna Cafe was a small establishment in DuPont Circle filled with students and young professionals. Eleanor arrived early, chose a corner table, and waited. At 7:15, a woman about 50 years old approached, brown hair, conservative business suit, and eyes that reflected years of carrying heavy secrets. I'm Margaret Thornton Hayes, said the woman sitting down, great-granddaughter of Isabella Thornton Blackwood. Elena felt her pulse quicken. She was facing a direct member of the family she had been investigating. "Why are you helping me?" Margaret looked around nervously before responding. "Because I've lived my whole life knowing that our family fortune was built on a lie. My great-grandmother told me the truth before she died. What happened at the Miller barn was just the beginning." She opened a briefcase and extracted a thick folder. "These are documents I've been collecting for years. Private correspondence between Circle members, minutes from secret meetings, lists of historical material they've suppressed." Elena examined the documents with trembling hands. There were letters discussing the Miller problem, dated just months after the Civil War, detailed plans to manage the historical narrative, lists of historians who had been dissuaded from investigating certain topics. "My family and the others have been rewriting history for 160 years, continued Margaret. "Not just hiding the Miller barn, but dozens of other incidents, massacres of Native Americans, medical experiments on black soldiers, summary executions of Confederate prisoners. Why are you telling me this now?" "Because the Circle has decided that you represent an existential threat. They're planning something more than academic pressure." Margaret leaned forward. "There are precedents, Dr. Martinez. Other researchers who got too close to the truth." Eleanor felt a chill. "What happened to them?" "Car accidents, sudden heart attacks, inexplicable suicides." Margaret took Elena's hands. "I'm not being paranoid. I have documents showing how they've eliminated threats in the past." She extracted another folder. "This is Professor David Hutchinson from Columbia, 1987. He was investigating Union war crimes. He died in a skiing accident." "This is Dr. Robert Chen from Berkeley, 1995. He found evidence of medical experiments on Confederate prisoner soldiers. Heart attack at 38 with no history of heart problems." Elena studied the documents, feeling her blood freeze. The cases followed a pattern. Researchers approaching Circle secrets, followed by convenient deaths. "What do you want me to do with this information?" "Make it public before it's too late, but be smart. The Circle has unlimited resources and connections everywhere." Margaret stood up to leave. "And Dr. Martinez, trust very few people. The Circle has informants in places you wouldn't expect." With Margaret Thornton Hayes' documents, Elena had sufficient evidence to expose the century-old conspiracy of the Circle, but she also knew that time was running out. The escalation of pressure and implications of physical threats made each day crucial. Elena, James, and Marcus met in a new location each day, rotating between cafeterias, public libraries, and parks. They had developed a basic security protocol: arrive separately, communicate by disposable phones, and never discuss sensitive details in enclosed places. The Washington Post journalist, David Richardson, had been reviewing the documents Eleanor had provided. His experience in government corruption investigations had convinced him of the material's authenticity. "This is the biggest story I've worked on," said Richardson during a meeting in a Virginia park. "But I need independent verification before publishing. The Post can't afford to be wrong on something of this magnitude." Elena had anticipated this. "I have contacts at the Smithsonian Institute who can authenticate the documents. We can also get additional testimonies from Margaret." But when Elena tried to contact Margaret 3 days later, her phone had been disconnected. Her address turned out to be an empty apartment, and no one at her supposed workplace had heard of her. "Do you think something happened to her?" asked James, clearly worried. "Either they're protecting her or they're silencing her," Elena responded grimly. Meanwhile, pressure on the team intensified. Marcus received formal notification that he was being investigated for misuse of university resources. James found that his access to all academic databases had been revoked. Elena discovered that her contract renewal application was being reviewed by the tenure committee. "They're systematically closing all academic avenues for us," observed Marcus during an emergency meeting. "Soon we won't have a platform from which to operate." It was then that Richardson called with urgent news. "The Post is ready to publish, but something strange is happening. This morning, the editor-in-chief received calls from 3 major advertisers threatening to withdraw their advertising if we publish historically irresponsible material." Elena sank into her chair. "How did they even know you were working on this? That's the million-dollar question. Either we have a leak or they're monitoring our communications." Paranoia had become reality. The Circle not only had influence in universities and archives, they had connections in major media. "What options do we have left?" asked James. Elena had been considering alternatives. Internet, independent blogs, social media, citizen journalism sites. They can't control everything. "But without the backing of a respected institution, who's going to believe us?" asked Marcus. It will sound like conspiracy theory, unless we have evidence so overwhelming it's impossible to ignore, said Elena. She turned to Richardson. What would you need for the Post to publish regardless of external pressure? Richardson thought about it. Indisputable physical evidence, the original photograph, documents authenticated by multiple independent experts, and at least 2 additional verifiable sources. Elena felt a spark of hope. I think I know how to get at least part of that. Elena had remembered something crucial. Dr. Sarah Chen had mentioned she had contacts in international archives. If the Circle had been suppressing evidence in the United States, maybe related evidence had survived in other countries. Chen responded immediately when Elena contacted her, using a disposable phone. I've been waiting for your call. I found something in British photographic archives that will interest you. They met at the National Museum of American History, blending among tourists while Chen shared her discovery. The British had military observers with both armies during the Civil War, Chen explained in a low voice. One of them, Captain James Worthington, took independent photographs of the Maryland campaign. Chen showed Elena prints of photographs that appeared to be from the same period as the Miller Barn image. Look at the date on this one, September 16, 1862, one day after the incident. The photograph showed the same barn, but from a different angle. In the foreground, British soldiers observed while Union soldiers carried bodies out of the building. The expressions on the British observers' faces were of horror and disgust. Worthington wrote in his official report that he had witnessed acts contrary to the civilized laws of war, continued Chen. His superiors ordered the report classified, but a copy survived in War Ministry archives. Elena felt they had the independent verification they needed. Can we get official copies? I already have them, smiled Chen. And there's more. Worthington kept a detailed personal diary of everything he witnessed. The diary was devastating. Worthington described not only the massacre at the Miller Barn, but multiple similar incidents he had witnessed during his time with the Union Army. He wrote about unofficial orders not to take prisoners under certain circumstances, medical experiments on wounded Confederate soldiers, and the systematic use of terror against civilian populations sympathetic to the South. This changes everything, Elena murmured as she read. It wasn't an isolated incident, it was policy. With this independent British evidence, Richardson finally had what he needed to convince the Post to proceed with publication regardless of external pressure. But the Circle wasn't going to give up easily. While Elena, James, and Marcus prepared the final revelation, powerful forces mobilized for one last attempt to silence them. Elena received a final call from the female voice that had started everything. This time Margaret sounded terrified. They're going to do something drastic tonight. Leave town immediately. The line went dead, leaving Elena with an impossible decision. Flee for her safety or risk everything in one last push to expose the truth. Elena chose the truth. That night, while unknown forces moved in the shadows, she and her team worked feverishly to ensure that the story of the Miller Barn would finally see the light after more than 160 years of darkness. The dawn of November 22, 2024, while Eleanor worked in her apartment preparing the final documents for Richardson, she heard footsteps in the outer hallway. She approached silently to the door and looked through the peephole. 2 men in dark suits were examining the locks of the other doors in the hallway. Elena knew the moment had arrived. She took the backpack she had prepared with copies of all documents and the memory card with the British photographs. She left through the rear fire escape just as she heard her front door being forced. She headed directly to the Washington Post Office, where Richardson and his editorial team had been working all night. At 6 a.m., the first version of the article was ready for publication. The Historical Preservation Circle, a century-old conspiracy to rewrite American history, was published simultaneously in the Post's print and digital editions. The article included the original Miller Barn photograph, the independent British documents, testimonies from Margaret Thornton Hayes, and detailed evidence of the Circle's cover-up operation. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Within hours, the article had gone viral on social media. Other media began following the story. Academics across the country began examining their own archives, finding additional evidence of historical manipulation. But most significant was the public response. Descendants of families that had been silenced for generations began telling their own stories. A man from North Carolina revealed family diaries describing similar massacres. A woman from Tennessee shared photographs her great-grandfather had hidden for decades. The Historical Preservation Circle attempted a coordinated response, issuing statements describing the article as irresponsible revisionist history and an attack on American heroes. But the evidence was too overwhelming and too public to be suppressed. In the following weeks, congressional investigations were initiated. The FBI opened investigations into the Circle's activities. Universities began reviewing their donation policies and examining how external influences had affected their history departments. Elena, James, and Marcus were reinstated in their positions with official apologies from Georgetown. More importantly, they received federal funding to establish the Historical Transparency Project, an initiative dedicated to reviewing American archives for evidence of systematic historical manipulation. The congressional investigation revealed that the Circle had been operating for 101 years, suppressing not only evidence of Civil War war crimes, but also documents related to the Indian Wars, military medical experiments, and segregation policies in the armed forces. Their network of influence extended to more than 200 academic and cultural institutions. Margaret Thornton Hayes reappeared 3 weeks after publication, revealing she had been in witness protection after receiving direct death threats. Her testimony before Congress provided additional details about the Circle's internal operations. "For the first time in my life," said Margaret during her televised testimony, "I can sleep knowing I'm no longer complicit in this massive lie." 6 months later, Elena found herself at the same barn in Maryland where it all began. It was now an official historical site, with a plaque honoring the memory of the victims of the September 15, 1862 massacre. The original photograph, finally declassified, was displayed in a museum dedicated to examining the darker aspects of American history. "Was it worth everything we went through?" asked James, who had been promoted to assistant professor and now directed his own research on historical manipulation. Eleanor looked at the memorial plaque, where the names of the identified victims of the Miller Barn were listed: Confederate soldiers, civilians suspected of Southern sympathies, and even some Union soldiers who had objected to the orders. "Look around you," responded Elena. "These names were erased from history for 162 years. Their families never knew what had happened to them. Their descendants grew up believing they had simply disappeared during the war." Marcus, who had decided to dedicate his final years before retirement to the Historical Transparency Project, joined them. "We received more than 1,000 letters last week from people who found family documents that had been hidden for generations. Truth has a way of surfacing." The impact of the Miller Barn case extended far beyond American history. Other countries began examining their own archives for evidence of systematic manipulation. The case became an international case study on how economic elites can influence historical narrative. Elena knew she had paid a high personal price. Her apartment had been destroyed. She had lived with fear for months and had lost trust in many institutions she had previously respected, but she also knew she had participated in something greater than herself. "History is not just the past," she reflected as they walked back to their car. "It's also about who has the power to tell that history and what they're willing to do to protect their version of the truth." The sun was setting over the Maryland fields, where more than 160 years earlier, soldiers had posed for a photograph without knowing they were creating evidence of one of America's greatest secrets. Now, finally, that secret had been exposed, and the victims of the Miller Barn had found their voice after more than a century of forced silence. The Miller Barn photograph had become a symbol of the importance of preserving historical truth, no matter how powerful the forces trying to suppress it. And Elena knew her work had just begun.